Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to my impressions after putting about 10 hours into Nexomon Extinction. So, what is Nexomon Extinction? It is a creature collector in the vein of things like Pokemon and Digimon, and many other games in that genre. Koromon, Cassette Beasts, Pow World to an extent. So, what is Nexomon specifically? The general plot of the game is you're basically an orphan that's at an orphanage that's been trained to be a tamer of some sort, and you're getting ready to go out and catch your first Nexomon, and then all sorts of interesting chaos breaks loose where you get swept up in this battle between what they call tyrants, which are more or less ultra powerful Nexomon that are trying to gain control of the world. They're a little bit more intelligent than the average Nexomon. And you just get swept up in this contest between them and some of their human allies and a few other weird things here and there. It's actually a pretty interesting story, but we'll talk about that in just a moment. It's a different enough story that it's not really that derivative of other things. It does follow the normal fantasy tropes, but that's just because almost everything does. But it's a good story. So let's dive into a couple categories of discussion here. I figured we'd break this down and talk about the creature quality, the graphics, story, combat, and then I'd give a couple criticisms towards the end. So, creature quality. Right off the bat, you get thrown into some battles and you get to see not only tyrants, but dragons, and you get an actually really impressive selection of starters available to you in the form of 9 different starters. This represents all the different possible elements that you can have in Nexomon instead of just giving you 3 and you having to pick out all the other elements. You can actually pick whatever element you prefer to start with. Unlike a lot of other games where you get to actually pick out a starter, it's not a lifelong commitment in this one. As a matter of fact, within the first 2 or 3 hours of gameplay, if you really want to push, you can potentially have picked up copies of every single starter. So you're not stuck with the one starter that you go with, but you can actually end up putting together a whole team of starters, which is what I've done. I've actually went around and I just kind of made it a point to capture every single starter in the areas I went to, and I've been primarily using them. So what about the quality of the creatures in general? All right, if I want to create an arbitrary scale here, that scale would be from Pokemon to Digimon. Now, why put those two on an opposite scale? If you're familiar with both of them, it's probably super obvious to you right off the bat. If you're not familiar with them, well, Pokemon, number one, has been around so long that it's got a god-awful amount of creatures. So almost everything you can imagine can be represented by a Pokemon. But for the most part, they look relatively normal. They look like creatures. They can be weird creatures, but they just kind of look like animals or permutations of that with a few minor alterations. Then you jump to the other side of the thing, which is Digimon. And Digimon has everything from relatively normal looking creatures to humanoid thirst traps and creatures that are basically just guns given life. So it's got a pretty wild extreme there, going from trying to stick to feasible, although fantasy-ish creatures, to just whatever you can actually imagine in a fever dream. So where does Nexomon sit on this sort of scale? It actually leans closer to the Pokemon side of things. To give you an example of where I think the middle would be, I think Pal World's actually kind of firmly in the middle between those two. Has mostly relatively normal looking creatures, but then it does have the odd gun thrown into the mix and a couple weirdly suggestive pals here and there. So it's sort of my center point of this weird creature collector equivalent to the political compass. But that aside, in terms of just the oddness of the creatures, which I don't find them to be that odd at all, they're very well designed. They have quite a variety of appearances, and you find some the usual suspects, so like a fire cat, but there's lots of unique ones. Their evolutions actually make sense. It's a very aesthetically pleasing game in general, but the creatures are really cool looking. The animations for them are cool looking, and when you actually go out to start hunting them down, there's a lot of really nice looking creatures that aren't even on the more rare side of the creature spectrum, which, as a small side note, all the creatures in this exist on a sort of trading card game rareness scale. Unfortunately, while some of the things on the common side still look really cool, they're just not that useful, so that's a little bit of a difference between it and the average TCG scale. Generally, the more rare it is, the more powerful it is, and the more likely you are to actually put it into your party. Like, I do believe the starters are either super rare or mega rare, so they're pretty much always good, which is the reason why they're starters, and I would imagine that's why they're given that rarity. They've made sure that if you picked it out, you could keep it with you for the whole game. But that doesn't mean it's actually hard to find good Nexomon. It's really not that bad, and the catch rates are not that bad. And if you're interested in shiny hunting, from what I understand, the baseline stat for the shiny equivalent in this game is like 1 in 1,000. Now, I've only encountered one, and I didn't notice it to be like super visibly different, but they're also rare, and that's not been a focus of my testing because that can be a whole game in and of itself. But the creature quality is high. You won't be disappointed on that side of it if creature collecting is the main thing you're wanting to do in this. Now, what about graphics? It looks gorgeous. Really, you should be able to tell that just from looking at the playthrough. And given the fact that this game started out on mobile, it's super impressive, the actual aesthetics of it. The fights look good. The little bit of animation you have for the attacks look nice. All the creatures look good. They're all given little tiny animations to actually make it look more vibrant. And the overworld looks really good. And it's got not really pre-rendered cutscenes, but it does have sort of cutscene-ish effects. And those look really nice as well. If you've been upset with the sort of visual decay of Pokemon over the last couple generations, then you'll probably like this. This is what I would say, as far as graphics go, people really wish Pokemon would do more of, which is improve and look nice. This is yet again another example of the Pokemon Company lacking. But I'm not going to spend this whole review just talking down about Pokemon. The truth is, without that series, most of us wouldn't have any interest in Creature Collectors to begin with. So I talk enough crap about Nintendo in general. I'm going to try to leave it out of this from this point out. But back to the graphics. Looks really good. No complaints on that front. So, moving on. Story quality. The story itself is actually pretty good. It's interesting. This concept that there's this sort of eternal war going on because the old king tyrant, or whatever he was defeated by the hero, which I believe is the story of the first game of the series, because this is actually the second game of the series. It's interesting. There's these massive creatures that are basically causing like calamitous level destruction across the planet as they're battling for control over the planet. And while most of these Nexomon are generally no more than animals, those particular Nexomon are super intelligent and for the most part seem to actually run around with a person. Like, mild spoilers for the story, but at one point you actually end up obtaining a tyrant egg, and part of the story is you going around trying to figure out how to hatch it to potentially use it to stop this battle and help the world in one way, shape, or form. So it's an interesting story. It's a little bit more serious than the average Pokemon game because this is functionally a post-apocalyptic style world, just without quite the same sort of depressing tint that normally has. Like, you pay attention to what people are saying, and they're not talking about very happy things, but it's all presented with a very happy sort of aesthetic. I think that's just meant to keep the game super approachable because they wanted to stick with that art style. And while it is serious, people do still seem generally content. So there's bad things happening, but people aren't just miserable and wallowing in that misery. So, story, pretty good. There is one criticism that I have of it, but I'll mention that towards the end because I'm going to try to front load all the positive stuff and then talk about the negatives at the tail end. So what about combat? Combat in this is excellent. You actually have to really think about the matching that you're going up against. You've got to get somewhat familiar with what the typing matchups are. And you're better off if you can actually swap in creatures that do have a type advantage against what you're fighting against. There's potential in this where you really defensive Coromon kind of come out ahead, because in certain fights you get smacked really hard. However, you do have to actually think about the encounters. The world scales with your Nexomon, so you're never really outpacing the world around you, and that lends itself to being a little bit more thoughtful than just multiplayer battles, which, if we're honest, is about the only place a certain other series really requires a lot of thought anymore. Some of these fights challenge me in a way that I haven't actually felt challenged by a CreatureCollector since I played Pokemon Red, and I played it when I was 9 or 10, so it's not like I was at the peak of my intellectual capacity at that point in time. And really, even with that game, the only actual challenge was the Elite Four. Now, don't get me wrong, this is not the Dark Souls of Creature Collectors. These fights are not exceedingly difficult. You're just not really capable of turning off your brain and just going about your day in this. Now, you can, to a degree, with the wild encounters, sort of, but when you start getting into things like the dungeons and boss fight, not only do you really need to consider type matchups, but in those situations, you also really need to make sure you're going in with a decent stock of items to use, because if you find yourself in a position where your main Nexomon for the fight, you know, the one that's actually advantaged with its type, gets taken out, you're going to have a hard time getting through the fight. Like the very first boss fight, which is what I'm highlighting in the background right now, you can't just power your way through it. You kind of can a little bit, but you have to go about it kind of strategically, because other creatures come out besides just the boss. And the boss fights normally have a decent little variety of creatures. There's never like a hardcore surprise, but you do have to be prepared to swap things out, because if you just go for a hard counter of the main creature, you're going to be pretty much countered yourself more than likely. So, combat, it's not brain dead. It's also not rocket science. Like I said, I don't want to overplay it, but it's fun. It gives you something to actually do. You really have to consider it. There's more than one instance where I would go in against a boss and actually find myself just barely losing the first time around, in which case it usually just kicks you back out of the dungeon, or it kicks you back just a little bit, and you have an opportunity to grind out a few more levels or try to get things balanced out, because the game does scale, but it scales in a kind of a weird way. It's like it scales up to a certain point, then when you beat a boss, everything sort of scales again. Still not quite nailed that down exactly, but it creates for interesting situations where you do need to think a little bit, and you can't just pop one thing in and spam your way to winning. Yeah, so one last thing to comment on before we move over into the criticisms, and that would be the music. It's good. I don't really think there was anything that stuck out super hardcore to me, but to be honest with you, music is not something that I normally give a whole lot of listening to, except for outside of like super giant games, because normally I play a lot of games muted, just pop headphones in and listen to other videos while I'm actually playing a game. But the music in this is fun. It's snappy, catchy. It fits in with the background enough so that I actually noticed it, which is different whenever you do tend to play games the way that I play them. So, music is good. Now, onto the criticisms. And just to clarify before we move into the criticisms, because if you're even somewhat familiar with the game, you'll recognize that the footage that I put up in the background is mostly from the very beginning of the game. I played until about the 6th or 7th main story quest, so more or less about a third of the way through the game. So I've got a decent way into the actual game. I'm just trying to avoid showing later stuff to avoid putting too many spoilers up for people that actually care about the story, because the game does overall have a really decent and worthwhile story to dive into. that being said, let's talk about my criticisms for a moment. The thing that irritates me the most is the cat. So, what am I talking about? I dropped the footage back to an earlier part in the story to highlight the cat over to the right. Why? Because he irritates the shit out of me. He is basically a walking fourth wall break. He's an example of what people are doing when they're making fun of millennials and the way they write things. And I'm a millennial myself. It's like a non-funny Deadpool. The story, for the most part, presents itself as relatively serious, which, yeah, within this type of genre is not super serious. You know, it's meant to be a play on the typical hero trope. All right, so future me, during editing, I actually thought about this a little bit more, so I'll lower the volume of me ranting about the cat for a bit because I think I have a slightly clearer explanation. The story itself actually hits like a story aimed at kids, you know, just because of the way the writing's done is the very sort of same style that Pokemon did in the early games. And he seems more like, I guess, an adult thinking the story through logically, making fun of the story because of the sort of juvenile nature to it. Even though there's those hints of seriousness, it still very much takes on that kind of happy-go-lucky kids game type of vibe. And I just find it irritating to have the game mocking itself. That much, at least. It seemed to have kind of tapered off by the point in the story that I was at, but every time it happens, it just ruins the effect. So anyway, I'll go back to turning me up and let me continue to rant about this a little while, because I was like, okay, if I'm going to have to deal with this guy for the whole game, I don't know that I want to. So I played up to this point and got up to the point where I got the starter, and you go into the cave, and then started trying to farm up the next starter, and it's since every single time he popped up in a dialogue tree, or well, not dialogue tree, but just in a series of dialogue, he was doing stuff like that. It just irritated me enough that I just kind of stopped for a bit. I decided to power on through it because I remembered enjoying the combat, what little bit I got to experience this early in the game, and it turns out that's actually pretty addicting. And when you really get into it, he's not popping up and saying stuff that much. It's in almost every single scene in the game at some point he makes some sort of fourth wall break style comment. I just don't like him. I feel like he actually drags the game down, and that overall, if you removed him from the game would be infinitely better. Like, I'm not going to use any sort of arbitrary scaling metrics here and give some sort of random number out of 10, because it would just be a number that I'd pull out of my ass. But I do feel like Nexomon Extinction is actually pretty close to perfect for the type of game that it is. And he drags it back from being in that perfect state. At least he's one of the key things for it. The other criticisms I have, I can actually get over. I would love to see a mod for the game that just completely removes him. Alright, so a little bit less on the hyperbolic side. What's another thing that actually bothers me a little? I'm not a super big fan of the leveling. At least at first. Leveling feels kind of inconsistent until you actually start getting together the more or less the items that replace XP share. Once you get enough of those items, you can kind of scatter them through your party, and things smooth out a little bit, actually to the point where you can set things up to where the person that's actually the active Nexomon is not even the one that gets the most experience. But up until that point, and it's also a little bit of a grind to get the item needed to get enough of those, because there's two different experience items. There's one that boosts the amount of experience you get directly. The other gives you a percentage of the experience that other Nexomon actually receive. So you can take advantage of that to smooth out the experience gain curve a little bit. But it takes a while to get those items. The little colored stones you've seen pop up here and there, you mine them and you use that as a currency to buy items that you can actually use to kind of augment your Nexomon and boost some of the stats. And so you have to go and actually buy these stones from a particular place that pops up not too late into the game. Like it's pretty early on. It's the first major city you go to. So you gain access to the ability to purchase them early on, but you're going to have to go out of your way to farm up enough materials to actually buy enough of them to really smooth things out, because you got to get the rank 3 one, which requires 5 of each type of stone, and you'll need 4 of them to actually boost up the experience share to the point where it's worthwhile. To me, in a game where the actual world scales with your characters, that makes things a little bit harder than they absolutely need to be. Like, I know I said I wasn't going to mention Pokemon that much, but this is one of those things where it's been an important criticism from the Pokemon community for a while. A lot of people aren't super happy with the way XP share actually works in Pokemon anymore, because you just tend to get it from the beginning. And they kind of give you, I think in the last one, they give you the option to turn it off if you want to. But people had been wanting something to where they didn't get XP share automatically. The problem is, one of the big differences between Pokemon and Nexomon, and the reason why not having an innate XP share that you can just turn on and off is a little bit more of a problem in Nexomon than it is in Pokemon. In Pokemon, you can basically pick one character or one Pokemon and power level that thing, and then you can even power through gyms that take advantage of your weakness. Like, I don't think I ever took Charizard out of my party in the first generation, and most of the games I don't take my main starter out. And a lot of the times they end up finishing the gyms out for me. And unless I'm going to a gym or against an opponent that is literally the polar opposite of that starter, it's usually not a problem. And even with those, if you level it up enough, it's still not a problem. That's not the way this game works. You can actually out-level your opponent in Nexomon by a decent bit, and if they're the opposite element of you, if you can't manage to crunch them down in a couple turns, they will take out your Nexomon. Since power leveling is not quite the issue in Nexomon that it is in Pokemon, not having the XP share means that you don't have a well-balanced party most of the time. So what ends up happening is, once you have one Mon that's gotten a little bit ahead, you actually end up having to rotate in your party and grind them up. And it really does start to feel like a grind after a bit, because experience gains sort of slow down the higher up your creatures get, which is normal. But it gets to where it feels really slow. Now, if you really want that type of grind, this is the game for you. You can choose to not use the XP boosting systems and grind to your heart's content. Personally, I feel like it's a little bit off pace in this one. Now, I do think that could be tweaked through a few minor adjustments, like maybe making getting the XP item a little bit easier. Personally, I feel like XP share should just be an option that you can either turn on or off. They have plenty of other settings in the game that are things you can tweak to adjust your experience, like a lot of modern games are doing, which I actually kind of find cool that we're more and more getting a wide variety of options that we can tweak to adjust our experience to fit our personal play preferences. But that's not one that they put in there. And I'm not 100% certain with the way they've set a lot of this stuff up why. All right. There is one other thing that kind of compounds this XP share issue, and that's that the world doesn't really scale super evenly all the time. It seems like there's sort of gates, if you will, for how high up everything will scale based off of what boss you've currently cleared. And it's almost like killing certain bosses accelerates that scaling a little bit. And what this introduces is a bit of a weird situation. So there's no real compulsion to keep the Nexomon that you specifically caught early on. And what I mean by that is, you can find a higher level version of it, catch it, and if it's higher level than the one you've got in your party, all you have effectively done is save yourself some time. Like, you do not have to do anything to make sure that one's going to be the same caliber of the one that you have. Like, there's very, very few drawbacks to just catching a higher level version. So if you do come across one that's higher level, it's you catch it and then just instantly drop it into your party and send the other one to your box. I find this to be a problem personally. And the reason being, I think, is best exemplified if we talk for a second about Nuzlockes. Nuzlockes and creature collectors are super popular. They're generally this, like, to get to the basics of it, the creature that you have going into an area, there's a bunch of other restrictions on how many you can catch, but the creature you have going into an area is the one that you're going to keep throughout that whole area, or just throughout the whole game. And when it dies, it's gone. It's like a hardcore version for your creatures in a creature collector. And you can't just go back and get another copy of it because you're restricted very heavily. Like normally, the way a lot of them work is the first creature you actually encounter in an area is the one that you have to catch, and you can't catch any of the other ones. So when something dies, you may or may not get a replacement for it. And part of the reason why Nuzlockes, I think, are so popular is it creates a situation where people really sort of grow attached to the creatures that they're using, and then when they die, that becomes a really big impact. So having a system set up where you're actually kind of encouraged to replace the creatures that you've been using with newer versions of them just because they're a higher level, it goes towards damaging that sort of immersion and connection that you build with the game, which is basically the same reason why I have a problem with Cat. He damages the immersion aspect and the connection you make with the game. So you throw those two things together, and that's two decent sized strikes in a game that plays really well, looks really good, and has some actually pretty interesting mechanics to it. I guess for the sake of complete disclosure, I'm not a super big fan of level scaling anyway in games in general. I feel like it tends to destroy sort of the power fantasy aspect of playing a game. But realistically, not every game has to fulfill some sort of power fantasy. So whatever, that one's sort of a take it or leave it thing. It doesn't completely break a game for me if it does have level scaling. And I actually think that other than the weird jumpiness of the level scaling in Nexomon, most of the time, once you get past that initial hop up, it's all right. Like it keeps them just far enough ahead of your party that you never really feel like you can let your guard down that much. But I guess that plays into the thing where I do have a little bit of a criticism of level scaling, and that's that you never really feel overpowered, which I find to be fun in games. But that's not a necessary aspect of a game for me to enjoy it, so whatever. Half a dozen of one, six of the other. Now, take the cat out and ignore the temptation to just catch higher level mons. And I actually think this is probably one of the best creature collectors out there. It's one of the best ones that I've played. Like, even with those issues, it's hard for me to emphasize enough how much I loathe that goddamn cat. I actually think this is a really, really fun game. Once I got past my initial reservations and just dove into it, it's a really fun game. It plays really well. It's got really cool creatures. The reason why I'm only a third of the way through the story after 10 hours, because it's really not that hard to grind through the story, if I'm just being blunt, is because I would spend an hour at a time just running around catching creatures in an area, trying to collect everything that I could find in that area. I did actually successfully get all 9 starters before I finished the 10 hours, but I actually did that pretty fast in it. The world is somewhat open world in the sense that if you can figure out a few tricks, you can actually travel to pretty much any zone right from the get-go in the game. So if there's a creature you want to catch, you can go get it and come back and then play through the story with the exact party you want. It's a very well thought out, well put together game. And while I spent a decent amount of time talking about criticisms, don't let that take away from it or make you think that you shouldn't play it. I would absolutely recommend anyone that even slightly enjoys creature collectors or has a little bit of a nostalgia tinge for Pokemon, play this game. I do believe this game can wholeheartedly scratch that itch for an old school Pokemon game. It is a fun game. It looks good. It sounds good. The trapping system is actually not that bad, which, by the way, they do throw a few things in where you can actually make it more likely that you catch them. And I do believe they have a demo out on mobile. I don't know if there's a demo on Steam. I know I tried the demo in mobile, or at least I think I tried it. I may have actually got it for free at some point for some bizarre reason. I can't remember if I just bought it outright or if there was a demo or what. I'm pretty sure there's a demo on mobile. I don't know if you can actually get one on Steam, but the games play basically the same other than mobile feeling like the trapping mechanic is a little bit less forgiving. That was one thing I do remember from playing through on my phone at first, was it felt like it was hard to actually catch things. It doesn't really feel like it's that hard to catch them on Steam. Could just also have been I didn't really fully understand the system at first. But highly recommend it. I would say ignore my criticisms because really half of them boil down to preference, and give it a shot. You'll probably find that you like it if you've liked any Pokemon game ever. If you don't like CreatureCollector games in general, I'm not really sure why you've watched a half hour into this video. But do recommend it. Go out and try it. And always remember, if I can beat it, so can you.